our series, Journey Life, Lessons from Old Testament People of Faith. And we're winding up. We've got one more lesson after today, winding up our study of the book of Joshua. And you know, if you turn to the book of Joshua, Joshua begins with basically God encouraging Joshua to take the place of Moses. I mean, very opening verse, Moses, my servant, is dead. So you be strong, you be courageous, you lead these people into the promised land. And so you have this wonderful story of Joshua as he leads the people across the Jordan River, as they celebrate Passover, they rededicate their lives. And then you have this wonderful story of them preparing to conquer the land. And as they prepare to conquer the land, you have two stories, two battles. The first battle is the Battle of Jericho. And it's the battle that they let God fight for them. And, of course, they win the battle. The second battle is the Battle of Ai. And that particular battle, they decided to do it themselves, and it was a disaster. And basically, you learn that you need to depend upon the Lord if you're going to do what God has called you to do. And then what follows after that, from Joshua 6 through Joshua 12, is a series of battles. You have all of these battles of where Israel's going up against the Canaanites. You have the Canaanites who are organizing these groups of kings who are going to try to stop Israel from taking the land. And you have just the record of these battles, with a famous battle where Joshua literally calls upon the sun and the moon to stop in the sky, and they do, in order for them to win the battle. And then when you get to Joshua 13 through 22, you get to some of the most boring scripture in all the Bible. And if you've done your daily Bible reading, you get to it, and it's like reading the genealogies in 1 Chronicles. You're like, you got to be kidding. Or the sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. I mean, let's be honest. Some of the Bible will put you to sleep fast. And this is one of them, because what this is, from chapter 13 to 22, is where Joshua divides the land among the tribes. Now, I don't know if you've tried to read an old deed before. June and I, we own a piece of property that was her family's property, dating all the way back to the early 1900s. And when you read the deed, it will say, the property begins near the rock, beside the oak tree, and it'll run about, 40 feet to a fence post, where it then goes kind of northwest. I mean, you're reading this going, I have no clue where the property line is. I mean, who can understand this? Well, that's what this is. This is about 9 chapters of reading about maps, about where the tribes and their demarcations were. And you're like, oh, please save me, because you have no idea where any of these places are. You're just kind of guessing where these property lines were back in the ancient Israelite communities. And so you think, well, let's just skip all this. But if you do, you skip an important part. It's a story embedded in this that's one of the most exciting stories in all the Bible. And so when the tribes came together to divide up the land, basically Joshua said, who goes first? And God said, Judah goes first. And so Judah comes to find out which land they're going to get as an inheritance from the Lord. So now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, all right, so Joshua is dividing up the land. Caleb comes as the representative from Judah. Why? Because he's the old man in the house. I mean, he's the old guy. He is at least 20 years older than everyone else in Judah. You see, he was 40 years old when he spied out the land. And as a result of the rebellion of the other 10 spies, Joshua and he said, we can take the land. But the other 10 said, we can't take it. Because of that, God said, everyone who came out of Egypt 20 years and older is going to die. Which meant everyone died who was from Joshua's age 20 years younger. So here's Joshua, and he's basically, 85 years old. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And the nearest person to him, 65. And so he's the old man in the house. And so he comes to Joshua and he says, you know what the Lord said to Moses? the man of God at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. Now, if you go back to the text there in Numbers 14, and we looked at that a few weeks ago, but because of my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. There's the promise of God. Okay? God made a promise to Caleb. Because you have been on my side, I am going to give you an inheritance in the land. And if you turn over to Deuteronomy, it's the land that he actually spied out. That's the land he was given. He will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on. That was the promise of God. So if you can just picture the scene, for over 45 years, Caleb's been waiting for an inheritance. 45 years. Longing to go back to the land he had spied out. Longing to take it as a promise from God. And now it's time to divide up the land. And so he comes to Joshua and he says, would you please give me that land? And notice what he says. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought him back a report according to my convictions. 40 years old. Now it's 45 years later. Joshua was probably 20, maybe 30 years old. He's not as old as Caleb is. Caleb's the oldest living person in Israel at this time. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he's kept me alive for 45 years. So they spent 40 years in the wilderness, and the last 5 years, Caleb spent fighting. 5 years of war. I mean, y'all think about World War II. Started in basically 1941, December of 41, and went through the summer of 1945. They fought longer than that. They've been fighting for 5 years. And now he says, here I am today, I'm 85 years old. Now, the thing you need to understand about why this is important is even though they've been fighting for 5 years, they've not taken the land. They've not taken it at all. They've been defeating the Canaanites. They've been capturing territory. But as far as the whole land of Canaan, they don't have hardly any of it. And notice why. The Lord your God will drive out the nations before you little by little. That's something I don't think most of us realize. Is that when they go into the land, they set up camp, they begin to fight, they keep defeating these kings, they're destroying some of the cities they'd capture, and then the Canaanites would come back in and re-inhabit them. But notice what he says, you will not be allowed to eliminate them all at once, or the wild animals will multiply around you. By the way, y'all ever noticed wild animals multiplying around us? Anybody have a problem with deer? Anybody at all? I mean, I'm like, there's more deer in Hendersonville than there are humans. I mean, you can't grow stuff in your yard. You can't put out a garden unless you put a 15-foot fence up. I mean, they're everywhere. And I don't know about y'all, but when I was a kid, there were no deer. I mean, we've gone from no deer to deer everywhere. I look at June and I say, oh dear. Man alive, where'd these come from? You know, they're everywhere. That was the concern that God had. He's like, listen, the wild animals will multiply if I drive all of the Canaanites out at once. We're going to do it a little bit by little. You're going to capture territory. I'm going to do a lot to you territory. And then you've got to go and capture it. So 5 years of war with many more years to follow. And Caleb knew that. I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. I love that. I love the attitude that Caleb had. Now, you need to understand something about Caleb. He's 85. At this time, people are living up a little bit over 100. Moses lived to be 120. Joshua lived to be 110. And so basically, when you're trying to figure out how old would Caleb have been in comparison to how long we live, the answer would be somewhere around 50, maybe 50 to 55 years old. And he says, listen, I'm just as strong, I'm just as vigorous, I'm ready to go into battle at 50, 55 years old as I ever was. Which leads us to lesson number 1. One of the most important lessons about the story of Caleb. Don't let the years rob you of your spiritual passion. I mean, if there's a lesson that comes out of the story of Caleb, it is that we never retire from God's work. I remember several years ago, back at this first church where I served as a song leader, I'd gone back and read some of the older bulletins and had noticed that there was this brother in the church that used to be very active in the church. I mean, he'd wait on the table, he would lead communion thoughts, he would serve as an usher, I mean, he was head of committee. I mean, he was very active in the church. But since I had been there, I'd never seen him do anything. And so one day I went up and I just asked him. I said, brother, I noticed that you did a lot at church. You were very active at church. I mean, you were constantly doing things during the worship services. I mean, you were leading communion thoughts. You were waiting on the table. You were doing this. You were doing that. But I noticed you don't do that anymore. Is there a reason for that? And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, when I retired from everything. And here I am, 20-something years old, thinking, is that the way it works? I mean, do we get up at a certain age and it's like, okay, it's time to pass it to another generation? Now, we definitely need to pass the torch to the next generation. And we'll see why that's important here in a few moments. But do we really retire from our service to God? One of the things that you find in Romans 12 from the Message, don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled in a flame. Be alert servants of the Master. Now, I chose this translation for a reason. Earlier in the week, June and I went camping with my brother and sister-in-law. We try to do that during the week of the 4th somewhere. And so we went down to North Mississippi. And to get down there, Blake, I had to travel through North Alabama. Okay? So I went down to Decatur, shot across from Decatur toward Tupelo. And I passed a church that just caught my attention. I mean, I just kind of looked at it and I'm like, did that sign say what I thought it would say? And the name of the church was Burnt Out Baptist Church. I'm serious. Burnt Out Baptist Church. And so when I got home, I'm like, I got to find out. And sure enough, there's a community down in North Alabama called Burnt Out, Alabama. And so the church there in the community, the Baptist church, just thought they'd put the name up there, Burn Out Baptist Church. How in the world do you advertise for that? Please come to Burn Out Church of Christ, where everybody is burnt out. You know, I remember there was a church for a long time going toward Clarksville. Exit 11, if you go to Clarksville, instead of turning back toward Clarksville, you turn back toward kind of the northeast, and there was a community down there named Little Hope. Y'all know where this is going, don't you? And the first time I passed by, the name of the Baptist church was Little Hope Baptist Church. And I thought, oh, come on, guys. Now, the last time I passed it, they had finally wised up, and they named it New Hope. You know, we got to get away from this Little Hope. It's killing us. Well, we as Christians don't need to be burnt-out Christians. We don't need to get to a point in our life where we say, you know what, we can't do anything anymore. Listen, we live in an age where more and more of our younger people are losing their faith, which means more and more of our older people have got to stand strong. And I mean, Joe got up a while ago and he said it right. He said, we're in the richest nation. We're the richest generation that's ever lived. We have more gifts, more talents, more ability, more experience than any people before us. It's not time to quit. We need to be like Caleb. So Caleb says, now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified. But, and I need you to notice this, the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. Now, if you go back to Numbers, this is what I love about it. When they came back, it's evidently Caleb who announced, there's giants living there. They went up through the Negev, came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Okay? This is the land that Caleb's asking for. Now, I want you to pick up on this. Caleb spied the land out. Not only spied it out, but recognized there were these giant guys living there. And he got their names. What y'all think about that? I mean, he comes back and he says there's 3 of them there in particular. Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai. And y'all, we can take it. And everybody else, no, we're like grasshoppers against these people. And so they weren't allowed to go into the land because of their lack of faith. But do you know what Caleb did? Caleb remembered their names. And for 45 years, these 3 guys, and I have to think that they probably were younger than Caleb at the time. He went and spied out Hebron. Here's these 3 giants, maybe in their late 20s, and he's thinking, okay, they think they are so bad. They're not nearly as bad as they think they are. And if you go back to Joshua, notice what the text says. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites, Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the sons of Anak. Now, y'all, he didn't kill them. He drove them out. And you go, how? By the way, and Stan may correct me on that. I hope I'm not wrong on this. But the name Caleb, the 3 letters in Hebrew that make up the name Caleb, is actually the Hebrew word for dog. Dog. I had a good friend who several years ago came up to me when his first son was born, and he said, Les, we got a son. God's given us a son, and we've given him a great Bible name, one of the Hebrews of the Old Testament. We named him Caleb. And I looked at him and I said, did you research the meaning of that name? He said, no. I said, Caleb in Hebrew means dog. And he just looked at me. And then he said, don't you tell my wife. We named our son Dog. Well, let me tell you, it's not just dog. Dog can be, by the way, in the Bible, dog is sometimes a word meaning trustworthy, faithful. Sometimes it's a very pejorative word. And so it can be either side of it. But basically what you had here is that Caleb was the pit bull that God sent up against these 3 giants. And basically what he said is, Hebron's not big enough for the 4 of us. And you guys are leaving. And can you imagine the sight when after Caleb had got finished with them and they're dragging themselves out of Hebron? Where are they going? They didn't have a clue. But they couldn't live there anymore because Caleb had driven them out. With God's help, nothing is impossible. Jesus said something in John 14 that we need to step back and think about a little bit. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. We sometimes misunderstand that. We think that in my name simply means saying in Jesus' name at the end of the prayer. That's not what Jesus is saying here. What Jesus is saying is, you may ask me for anything. His name is his identity. His name, Yeshua, God saves, means that you can ask anything having to do with who I am as the one who saves the world, and I will do it. John later on would kind of, in my view, correct it when he says, this is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, in who Jesus is, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we ask of him. The point simply being, folks, that listen, when we ask for something that's in the will of God, God is willing and ready to respond. God had called upon Israel to drive out the Canaanites. Here was Caleb saying, Lord, I'm ready to do it. If you'll just help me. And God said, I will help you. And you know, if there's anything that we need to realize is that God has a power available to us as long as it's a power used to advance His cause. That's absolutely amazing. You go over to Ephesians 3. Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Our problem is not that we don't have the ability to do it. Our problem is we don't have the imagination to do it. And that's what God is calling us to. He has given us a purpose, and He says, I'm with you, and I'll empower you to do it as long as you're doing what I've called you to do. And then number 3, and I love this lesson. Caleb was happy to work behind the scenes. We all know Joshua. Joshua becomes the name Jesus in the New Testament. Joshua is the one that God picked to replace Moses. Even though you had Caleb over here, older than Joshua, an incredible leader, and yet a leader who's willing to work behind the scenes. We read about him in the exploration in Numbers 13. We read about him here in Joshua as they're dividing up the land. We read about him in the book of Judges, the very first chapter. That's it. Caleb doesn't show up anymore. Nowhere found in the New Testament. And so you got to ask yourself, what's going on with Caleb? And Caleb reminds me of an old brother years ago who used to tell me, Les, I don't like to be out front. I'm not that kind of leader. I don't want to be out there, leading songs or leading in worship or teaching. He says, I just don't have those abilities. He says, but what I can do is I can help people. He was an old retired Greyhound bus driver. And what he would do when he wasn't driving his bus is he would help people, especially widows. I mean, he would go and he would work at their houses. He would go and he would mow their yards. My next door neighbor was a retired Greyhound bus driver, and he got down where he couldn't take care of his yard. Guess who showed up every week to mow his yard? This older brother there at the church I was working at. And if I was going on vacation, guess who else's yard got mowed? Mine and June's got mowed. I mean, we would pull in, we'd say, oh, brother so-and-so, he's been at it again. He would come up to me at church and he would say, Les, we need a new sign down at the road. The old sign's looking kind of rough, don't you think? I'd say, oh, yeah. He said, what would it cost to replace that sign? I'd go, I don't have a clue. He said, find out. And I'd go find out, and I'd call him up, and I'd say, hey, the cost of replacing that sign would be, $10,000. He would say, do it, and I'll write a check for it. He came in one day, and he says, I'm getting old. I can't hear real good. Anybody got that problem beside me? By the way, I have to ask June to repeat herself all the time. And I've decided it's one of two problems. Either June's talking like this all the time. And by the way, some of y'all know that. Or my hearing's not as good. My guess is it's a little of both. But anyway, this brother came in and he says, I can't quite hear. How old is our sound system? I said, I think it goes back to when we built the building. He said, how much would it cost to put a new sound system in? By the way, have you put in a new sound system lately anywhere? I mean, even at the house, it's going to cost you. And so I said, well, I'll find out. And I went and told him. He said, put it in. I'll write the check. He was one of these guys who was always behind the scenes, serving, helping, encouraging, doing what he could. That was Caleb. Caleb was someone who didn't want the limelight. He just wanted to do what God had called him to do. And because of this, Joshua blessed him. Son of Jephunneh, gave him Hebron as an inheritance. And I love verse 14. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since. He took the land. By the way, I don't know if you remember what Hebron was. Hebron's where Abraham bought a cave. It's where he buried Sarah. It's where he was buried. It's where Isaac was buried. Rebekah. It's where Jacob, Leah. It's where evidently they carried the bones back of Joseph to bury. Where? In Hebron. But they had to capture it first. I think that's why Caleb wanted that land. The text goes on, though, and then takes an odd turn. After Joshua dismissed the Israelites, and this is over in the book of Judges, they went to take possession of the land. Okay? In other words, they started fighting. They started taking possession of the land. They've been here now for years. But I mean, they still have a lot of work to do. And the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. But if you know the book of Judges, you know what happens next is not good. Look at what the text says. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. How long does it take for a country to forget God? 1 generation. That's all it takes. John, Mike, and I were talking about this morning. And I asked, are we living in that generation? A generation that says we don't want to serve God anymore. We want to serve the gods around us. Because that's what the Israelites did. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God. They served the Baals, the Asherahs. Those were the gods of the Canaanites. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. Stan, next time you're going to have to come up and read that for me, okay? All right. To whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. In other words, God said, you don't remember the slavery you had in Egypt. Your grandfathers suffered that. But I'm going to give you a taste of it. And of course, the people repented. And God, at that time, in the name of the book, of course, is Judges, would raise up a judge to deliver them. Anybody want to guess who he raised up? Watch this. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Now, you look at this and you go, okay, so it's Caleb's nephew. Well, it's not just Caleb's nephew. But Caleb needed to take a town. He said, whoever takes this town, I'm going to give my daughter to them as a wife. And Othniel's the one who took it. So he ended up marrying his first cousin. Now, I know some of y'all going, you're kidding me. No, they did that back then. It's illegal in Tennessee now, if y'all haven't heard. We've made, right, Farrell, we passed a law saying you can't marry your first cousin anymore. So go down to Mississippi, you'll be all right. But anyway, I wish I could laugh at that more, but I can't. All right. But this is Caleb's son-in-law, who becomes the first judge of Israel. And I can't help but wonder, why did God choose him? Was it because of the influence of his father-in-law, his uncle, the one who from the beginning followed him wholeheartedly? What made Caleb such an inspiration for God's people ever since? Because Caleb loved God with all of his heart, soul, and strength. Those are the words of God. Not our words, not the writers of the Bible, but God's words. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. In other words, he had taken to heart what Moses has said in Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And that's what Caleb had done. So as we get older, and I want to speak to those of us who are older. As we get older, we have a choice we have to make. We can begin to back off. Now, listen, I understand that we can't do what we used to do. All right, I understand that all too well. I don't know about y'all this week, but I'd go outside for 10 minutes and then go inside for 2 hours to rest. I mean, that's what the heat will do to me nowadays. But when it comes to the kingdom of God, I don't think we should ever retire. And what keeps us from retiring is that wholehearted love. That devotion that Jesus said, this is the first and the greatest of the commandments. Follow it, and everything else will fall into its place. And so speaking once again to those of us who are older, where are you at with your walk with God? Have you got to the point where you've given up? I hope not. I hope, like Caleb, that all of us can say, you know what, I'm just as strong spiritually today. In fact, stronger spiritually today than I used to be. Why? Because I love God with all my heart, soul, and strength. That's what the church at Hendersonville needs more than anything else. Yes, we need our young people. And we oftentimes speak to our young people. But we need those of you who are older as well. We need your abilities, your talents, your gifts, your ability to make this church what God wants it to be. And if you've not been doing that, maybe it's time to recommit. Maybe it's time to say, God, I'm coming back. If we can help you in any way and respond to the gospel, let us know how we can right now as we stand and sing.